So you want to own a private prison. You don't sell a product. You get paid per inmate per day. Sounds simple? It's not. There's no storefront, no customers to chase, just a contract with a government agency. That contract is the entire business. Everything else is just concrete and razor wire. Let's start with what it costs to build one. A medium security prison with 1,000 beds can cost over $200 million to construct. Land, fencing, guard towers, reinforced walls, secure plumbing that can't be used as a weapon. None of it is cheap. Buying an existing facility is faster. Some sell for a fraction of construction cost, especially in rural towns desperate for jobs. But a cheap prison is cheap for a reason. Usually the state that built it already walked away. Once you have the building, you need a customer, and there are only two kinds: governments and government agencies. Federal contracts come from ICE, the Bureau of Prisons, or the U.S. Marshals Service. State contracts come from a Department of Corrections. Local contracts come from counties needing extra jail space. Every single one of these contracts is built around one number: the per diem rate. Per diem simply means payment per person per day. It is the entire financial engine of this industry. A typical state per diem rate sits somewhere between $45 and $95 per inmate per day. That sounds small. Multiply it by 1,000 beds every day, all year, and you get tens of millions of dollars a year from one building. Here's the part almost nobody outside the industry understands. Most of these contracts include a minimum occupancy guarantee. The state doesn't just pay for however many inmates show up. It agrees to pay for a minimum number, whether the beds are full or not. In Ohio, one facility's contract guarantees payment for 95% occupancy, no matter how many people are actually inside. That means even in a good year for crime reduction, a bad year for you, the checks barely move. This clause is the reason private prison companies survive dips in crime rates that would kill an ordinary business overnight. It also means something darker sits quietly underneath the entire model. A business that needs bodies in beds to hit contractual minimums has a financial incentive for those beds to stay full. That incentive doesn't disappear just because nobody says it out loud in a shareholder call. So the revenue math looks bulletproof on paper. Guaranteed minimum, fixed daily rate, government backing. But building the thing and signing the contract is only the beginning of the spending. First expense, staffing. Correctional officers are the largest cost by far, easily 60% or more of operating expenses. And private prisons often pay less than state-run facilities, which creates a second problem: staff turnover. Some private facilities report annual staff turnover above 90%. That means the entire guard staff turns over nearly every year. New, undertrained officers running a facility housing violent offenders is not a hypothetical risk. It's a recurring headline. Second expense, healthcare. Every inmate is a constitutional obligation for medical care, whether they can pay or not. Chronic illness, mental health crises, emergency surgery, all of it comes out of the operator's budget, not the state's, once the contract is signed. Third expense, insurance and litigation. Lawsuits over inmate treatment are not rare in this industry. They are routine. Wrongful death suits, abuse allegations, negligence claims. Settlements can run into the tens of millions per incident. Fourth expense, maintenance on a building that never stops being occupied. No slow season. No empty months to do repairs. Locks, cameras, plumbing, HVAC, all running 24 hours a day under constant heavy use. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because the guaranteed payment model has a trapdoor built into it too. Just like the mall anchor clause, just like the hospital payer mix, this industry has its own version of the same trap. The trapdoor here is political, because unlike a shopping mall, a prison's entire customer base depends on government policy. If a state decides to reduce incarceration, reform sentencing laws, or end a contract, the guaranteed minimum disappears with it. This already happened. In 2019, California passed a law to phase out private detention facilities entirely. Illinois, New York, and several other states passed similar bans in the years that followed. For companies with billions in fixed infrastructure built specifically for this business, a policy shift is not a minor inconvenience. It's existential. Now flip it the other way. A different administration, a harder stance on crime or immigration, and demand explodes overnight. That's not theory either. It happened, and it happened fast. Let's talk about two real companies because their stock charts tell this story better than any spreadsheet could. CoreCivic and GEO Group are the two largest private prison operators in the United States. In 2016, under one administration, the Department of Justice announced plans to phase out its use of private prisons entirely. Both companies' stock prices collapsed within days of that announcement. Tens of percent gone almost overnight. Then a new administration took office. The phase-out order was reversed within weeks. Both stocks doubled, then kept climbing. Nothing about the buildings had changed. The policy had. Fast forward to more recent years, immigration enforcement tightened sharply, and detention demand surged again. CoreCivic's revenue from ICE contracts roughly doubled in a single year, jumping from around $120 million to over $245 million in quarterly revenue. GEO Group expanded its immigration detention capacity to more than 26,000 beds. New contracts opened across California, Texas, Virginia, Kansas, Tennessee, and Oklahoma in a matter of months. One CEO told investors the company was, in his words, perfectly positioned for the moment. This is the core truth of the entire business. You're not really in the prison industry, you're in the policy industry. Your revenue doesn't move because of your management skill. It moves because of an election, a court ruling, or an executive order. No amount of operational excellence protects you from a policy reversal you had zero input into. Now let's look at what happens when the guaranteed payment model runs headfirst into a real scandal. Idaho Correctional Center, once run by a company called Corrections Corporation of America, became infamous for a different reason entirely. Inmates and staff nicknamed it Gladiator School. Understaffing was so severe that inmate-on-inmate violence became a defining feature of the facility. A federal investigation later found the company had systematically understaffed the prison, in some cases falsifying staffing logs to hide it. The state of Idaho eventually terminated the contract and took the facility back under public control. The lesson underneath that story is simple. Cutting staffing costs is the easiest way to protect margin. It is also the fastest way to lose the contract entirely. Here's another case. Walnut Grove Youth Correctional Facility in Mississippi, run by a private operator for the state. A federal judge who reviewed conditions there described it in his ruling as a picture of such horror it could be unconstitutional on its own. Understaffing, rampant violence, and sexual abuse of youth inmates were documented in detail during the investigation. The state terminated its contract. The company's name became a case study taught in criminal justice programs for exactly the wrong reasons. Now here's the twist most people never expect. In both of these cases, the company didn't just lose money, it lost future contracts too. Because in this industry, a scandal at one facility can follow you into every future contract bid in every other state. Procurement officers remember headlines. A losing bid because of a reputation problem is invisible on a balance sheet, but it's real money lost. So the entire business rests on a strange balance. Cut costs too hard, and you risk a scandal that kills future growth. Spend too generously on staffing and care, and your margins shrink toward nothing because your revenue per bed is fixed by contract. There's no pricing power here. You cannot raise prices to a customer the way a normal business can. The per diem rate is negotiated once, locked in for years, and rarely moves except through renegotiation at renewal time. Meanwhile, your costs, labor, healthcare, insurance, all keep rising every single year regardless of what the contract says. This is the exact same trap that hit hospitals. Fixed revenue, rising costs, and zero control over either side of the equation. Here's a structural detail almost nobody outside finance knows about this industry. For years, CoreCivic was legally structured as a real estate investment trust, the same structure malls and hospitals sometimes use. That structure meant paying almost no corporate income tax, as long as nearly all profit got paid out to shareholders every year. The IRS eventually challenged whether a prison operator even qualified as a real estate company under that law. In 2021, CoreCivic converted back to a standard corporation, giving up that tax advantage entirely. Analysts said the move also reflected the sheer legal uncertainty of trying to call a prison a real estate investment. Even the corporate structure sitting underneath this business has been unstable. Let's talk about the other revenue stream almost nobody thinks about. Because prisons don't only make money from the state, they also make money directly from the people locked inside and from the families trying to stay in contact with them. Phone calls from prison have historically cost far more per minute than a normal phone call, sometimes 10 times as much or more. Video calls, often replacing in-person visits entirely in some facilities, come with their own per-minute charges. Commissary items, snacks, hygiene products, basic necessities are sold inside at significant markups compared to outside prices. Money transfer services used by families to send funds to inmates often charge steep processing fees on every transaction. None of this shows up in the big per diem number investors talk about, but across a large enough population, it adds up to real income. Critics call this a second economy, built entirely around a population that has no ability to shop elsewhere. Defenders call it a necessary cost of providing services inside a secure facility. Either way, it's revenue and it's real. Now let's actually run the numbers the way an owner has to run them. Say you operate a 1,500-bed facility under a state contract with a per diem rate of $70 per inmate per day. At full occupancy, that's over $38 million a year in gross revenue from the state contract alone. Add phone, commissary, and transfer fee revenue, and you might add another few million on top. Now subtract labor, roughly 60% of operating costs on a facility this size, easily $20 million or more a year. Subtract healthcare obligations, maintenance, insurance, and administrative overhead, and margins in a good year land somewhere in the 8 to 12% range. On $40 million in revenue, that's $3 to $5 million in profit. Solid, but far from the runaway fortune people imagine. That's the optimistic scenario. Full occupancy, stable contract, no major incidents, no policy shocks. Now the realistic scenario. Occupancy drops below the guaranteed minimum threshold for reasons entirely outside your control. A state reforms sentencing laws. Crime drops, diversion programs expand. All good outcomes for society, all bad outcomes for your revenue. Even with a minimum occupancy guarantee in the contract, renegotiation at renewal time can quietly lower that minimum. Staff turnover spikes because wages haven't kept pace with inflation, and now you're paying overtime just to maintain safe staffing ratios. A single serious incident, a riot, an escape, a death in custody triggers a lawsuit that can cost more than a year of profit to settle. Suddenly, that same $40 million facility is barely breaking even or worse, operating at a loss for the year. The difference between the good year and the bad year isn't a management decision, it's a policy shift or a single bad incident. Let's go back to Kingman, Arizona for a case that shows exactly how fast this can unravel. In 2010, 3 inmates escaped from a private prison in Kingman after a security failure during a riot. The escapees went on to kill 2 people in Gallatin, New Mexico, before being recaptured days later. An independent investigation later found major security failures at the facility, including alarms that had been disabled. The state of Arizona terminated its contract with the operator. The facility eventually closed. One security failure, one incident, an entire multi-decade revenue stream gone within months. This is the risk sitting underneath every single prison contract in the country, whether or not it ever gets triggered. You are not just managing a building, you are managing the single point of failure for your entire company's reputation. Now let's talk about the newest and fastest growing piece of this business, immigration detention. Unlike criminal incarceration, immigration detention operates under civil, not criminal law, which changes the contract structure entirely. ICE contracts are almost always structured as pure per diem, payment for each detainee actually present, sometimes with guaranteed minimums layered on top. When immigration enforcement intensifies, detention demand can spike within weeks, far faster than any state prison contract ever moves. This is exactly what happened recently. Detention populations surged, and both major operators activated previously idle facilities almost overnight. Idle capacity, buildings sitting empty and generating nothing, suddenly became the most valuable asset on the balance sheet. But but that same speed cuts both ways. Enforcement policy can reverse just as quickly as it accelerated. A facility fully staffed and expanded for a surge in demand becomes a massive fixed cost the moment that demand cools. This is why private prison stocks are some of the most politically volatile equities on the entire stock market. They don't trade on quarterly earnings the way most companies do. They trade on legislation, court rulings, and election outcomes. An investor buying shares in this industry isn't really betting on management. They're betting on the direction of an entire country's policy. Now, here's a detail buried inside these ICE contracts that deserves its own moment: detention standards. Facilities holding ICE detainees are supposed to meet specific medical, safety, and living condition standards set by the federal government. Multiple lawsuits in recent years have alleged serious violations of those standards, from inadequate medical care to unsanitary conditions. One recent lawsuit near Bakersfield, California, alleged insect infestations, sewage problems, and detainees denied access to food, water, and legal counsel. Another set of allegations in Louisiana described denial of medical care and severe overcrowding inside a detention facility. These aren't abstract public relations problems. They are active legal liabilities sitting on the books of a publicly traded company. Every lawsuit is a potential settlement, a potential contract termination, and a potential headline that follows the company into its next bid. So even in the fastest growing segment of this entire industry, the same structural trap keeps reappearing. Revenue can surge overnight, but so can the liability that comes bundled with running facilities at breakneck speed. Let's step back and ask the bigger question. Why do governments outsource incarceration to private companies at all? The pitch, historically, has always been cost savings. Private operators claim they can run facilities cheaper than the government itself. Independent research on this claim has been mixed at best. Some studies find modest savings. Others find little to no meaningful difference. Some studies have found that any savings often comes specifically from lower staffing levels and lower wages, the exact factors tied to safety incidents. In other words, the savings a state sees on paper can be the same savings that eventually produces a Gladiator School. There's also a political advantage governments get from privatization that has nothing to do with cost at all. Building a new public prison usually requires new government debt, new taxes, or new budget allocations that voters can see. A private prison contract, by contrast, can often be signed without any of that visibility. The cost is buried inside an operating budget line. This is part of why the industry has grown steadily for decades, regardless of which political party holds power in a given state. Now let's talk about the town, not just the company, because there's a whole second economy built around where these prisons get built. Rural towns with declining industries have actively competed to attract private prisons, the same way towns once competed for factories. The pitch to these towns is straightforward: hundreds of stable jobs, a guaranteed employer, tax revenue flowing into a shrinking local budget. Some towns have staked a meaningful share of their entire local economy on a single facility staying open and staying full, which means the same volatility that hits the company's stock price also hits the paycheck of an entire town's population. When a contract gets terminated or a facility loses its bid at renewal, it isn't just a corporate loss, it's a local unemployment crisis. This dependency is rarely mentioned in the glossy economic development brochures towns use to attract these facilities in the first place. It's the same monoculture risk you'd see in a town built entirely around one factory, except the product being manufactured is incarceration. So let's lay out the two real scenarios side by side, the way we did with the mall, the hospital, the jet. In the optimistic scenario, you run a well-managed facility under a long-term state or federal contract with a strong minimum occupancy guarantee. Staff turnover stays low, incident rates stay low, and the political winds in your contracting jurisdiction stay favorable for years at a time. Margins land in the high single digits to low double digits. Revenue is predictable. The business genuinely resembles the toll booth model people imagine. In the realistic scenario, one of several things happens, sometimes more than one at once. A policy shift reduces your guaranteed population. A staffing crisis triggers a safety incident. A lawsuit lands that costs more than a year of profit. Any one of these can turn a facility from a reliable cash generator into a liability the parent company is desperate to offload. And unlike a mall or a hospital, you can't quietly repurpose the building into something else if the contract disappears. A shopping mall can become apartments. A hospital can become a clinic. A 1,500-bed maximum security facility has almost no alternative use at all. When the contract ends, you're not left holding a flexible asset. You're left holding a fortress with no tenant and no obvious buyer. That's the single biggest difference between this industry and almost every other one we've studied on this channel. Every other asset has some kind of fallback value if the original plan fails. This one, in most cases, does not. So is owning a private prison actually a good business? The honest answer is that it's one of the most politically fragile businesses in America. Revenue that can double in a year because of one election. Revenue that can vanish just as fast because of the next one. Guaranteed minimums that protect you from ordinary market forces, but do nothing to protect you from legislation. A workforce that is chronically underpaid relative to the risk of the job, creating the exact turnover that produces the incidents that end contracts. And a physical asset that, unlike almost any other building in this world, has essentially one single use. The people who make real money in this business aren't the ones betting on good management. They're the ones correctly predicting policy years in advance. Everyone else is just hoping the political winds stay calm long enough to collect the next quarterly check. A prison looks like a fortress from the outside. Permanent, immovable, secure. From the inside, financially, it's one of the most fragile structures in the entire economy, not because the walls are weak, because the entire business depends on a contract that a single vote can rewrite overnight. The building isn't really the business. The policy is, and policy, unlike concrete, was never built to last.